What started as a routine conversation quickly turned into a tense exchange that no one in the studio was prepared for. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. It began as a fairly standard daytime interview. The set was bright, the audience was warm, and the tone at the table was measured but curious. Armie Hammer had joined the panel on The View for what was promoted as a candid conversation about rebuilding his career, public perception, and how life changes after intense media scrutiny. The hosts opened the segment the way they typically do, acknowledging his recent projects and the fact that his name had been in headlines for reasons beyond film work. At first, the exchange moved at a steady and comfortable pace. The moderators asked about his time away from major studio productions, how he had been spending his time personally, and what it felt like to return to interviews after a prolonged absence from mainstream press circuits. Hammer answered calmly, keeping his tone even. He spoke about reflection, therapy, spending time with family, and learning to step back from the noise of social media. The atmosphere shifted slightly when the discussion moved toward accountability and public trust. Sunny Hostin leaned forward in her chair, signaling she wanted to address the issue more directly. Her tone wasn't confrontational, but it was deliberate. She framed her question carefully, explaining that many viewers had strong feelings about public figures who returned to the spotlight after controversy. She asked him how he believed audiences should reconcile their concerns with his desire for a professional comeback. Hammer listened without interrupting. He nodded slowly, maintaining eye contact. There was a noticeable pause before he responded, the kind of pause that feels longer on live television than it probably is in real time. He acknowledged that people are entitled to their feelings. He said that he understood why some viewers might be skeptical. He added that rebuilding trust is not something that happens overnight, and that he does not expect universal approval. At this point, the conversation was still composed, but the pacing slowed. Hostin followed up by asking whether he believed the industry sometimes shields actors from meaningful consequences. The question was broader, but the implication was clear. The audience murmured slightly, reacting to the sharper tone of the inquiry. Hammer's posture straightened. He folded his hands together on the table before answering. He responded seriously, saying he could not speak for the entire industry but could speak for himself. He emphasized that he had faced personal and professional consequences. Without going into specifics, he referenced the loss of projects and the public scrutiny that affected his family. His voice remained calm, but there was firmness in it. He said that while the public conversation often simplifies complex situations, the lived experience of going through intense media coverage is far more complicated. One of the other co-hosts attempted to ease the tension by broadening the topic again, asking about mental health resources for people in the public eye. But Hostin returned to the core issue, clarifying that her concern wasn't about punishment but about responsibility. She explained that as a former prosecutor, she views public accountability as part of civic discourse. She asked directly whether he believed he had done enough to earn the opportunity to move forward publicly. That question marked the first clearly tense moment of the segment. Hammer inhaled, glanced briefly toward the audience, and then back at the table. He said that personal growth is ongoing. He acknowledged that some people may never feel satisfied with his efforts. He stated that he cannot control public opinion but can control how he behaves going forward. He stressed that he has sought help, taken time away, and focused on being a better person privately before seeking visibility again. The studio audience remained attentive and quiet. There was no applause, no audible disapproval, just the subtle stillness that often accompanies serious exchanges on daytime television. The camera cut briefly to the other hosts, who appeared thoughtful, some nodding, others watching carefully. Hostin then addressed the idea of privilege. She suggested that high-profile figures often receive second chances that everyday people do not. Her delivery was steady, not accusatory, but pointed. She asked whether he recognized that dynamic. Hammer did not raise his voice, but his tone became more resolute. He said that privilege exists in many sectors, including entertainment, and that he would not deny benefiting from opportunities throughout his career. However, he cautioned against assuming that visibility eliminates hardship. He explained that public disgrace carries its own consequences and that he would not characterize the past few years as easy. There was a brief moment when both spoke at once, a rare overlap that underscored the tension. Hostin began to clarify her point just as Hammer tried to elaborate on his previous answer. The moderator gently stepped in, reminding everyone that time was limited and encouraging one person to finish before the other responded. Hammer finished his thought by emphasizing that growth requires humility. He said he is not asking viewers to forget anything, but hopes they will evaluate him based on consistent actions over time. He repeated that trust is rebuilt slowly and that he is prepared for that process to take as long as necessary. Hostin listened closely and then softened her tone slightly. She said she appreciated his willingness to sit at the table and answer difficult questions. However, she maintained that public figures must understand the emotional impact controversies can have on audiences, particularly when those controversies touch on serious themes. As the segment continued, the discussion became less pointed and more reflective. Another co-host asked how his children have processed the media attention. That question shifted the focus from public accountability to personal experience. Hammer spoke about shielding his family as much as possible and about the importance of stability for children during uncertain times. Even as the tension eased, the earlier exchange lingered in the air. Viewers watching live could sense that this was not a promotional interview in the traditional sense. It had moved beyond light conversation into something more substantive. The tone of the panel remained respectful, but the seriousness of the discussion never fully dissipated. As part one of this conversation unfolded, what stood out most was not raised voices or dramatic gestures, but the controlled intensity beneath the surface. The pacing slowed, the questions became more deliberate, and the answers carried weight. It was the kind of exchange that daytime talk shows sometimes reach when they balance entertainment with accountability. And as the segment moved toward its midpoint, it was clear that the discussion between Armie Hammer and Sunny Hostin was not finished. The next round of questions would determine whether the conversation could find common ground, or whether the tension would rise even further. As the conversation resumed after a brief pause in pacing, the moderator shifted slightly in her chair and reminded viewers that this was meant to be an open dialogue. There was no commercial break yet, but the energy at the table felt as though everyone understood they were in the middle of something more layered than a standard promotional stop. Sunny Hostin returned to the discussion with a more structured follow-up. She clarified that her earlier questions were not about personal condemnation, but about transparency. She explained that viewers at home often feel disconnected from the private realities public figures describe after controversy. Her concern, she said, was about bridging that gap. She asked Hammer how he distinguishes between public relations efforts and genuine accountability. The question landed with noticeable weight. Hammer did not immediately answer. He leaned back slightly, then forward again, resting his forearms on the table. His expression remained composed, but the seriousness in his eyes was more apparent now. He said that he understood why people question motives. He acknowledged that in entertainment, there is always skepticism about whether someone is managing an image rather than confronting a problem. He stated clearly that, in his case, stepping away from projects was not a strategy but a necessity. He explained that during his time out of the spotlight, he chose not to participate in interviews because he did not feel ready to speak publicly. He said he needed distance to evaluate his own behavior and mental health. Hostin listened without interruption, her expression focused. When he finished, she asked whether he believed that public figures owe audiences detailed explanations, or whether privacy should take precedence. Hammer responded carefully. He said there is a balance. He argued that while public figures depend on audience support, they are still entitled to personal boundaries. He added that not every detail belongs in public discourse, particularly when other people's lives are involved. His tone was firm but not defensive. At that point, another co-host gently interjected, noting that many viewers might interpret silence as avoidance. She asked Hammer whether he worried that stepping away without speaking sooner contributed to speculation. Hammer acknowledged that possibility. He admitted that in hindsight, silence can create its own narrative. However, he maintained that he was prioritizing personal rehabilitation over public commentary at the time. Sunny Hostin then shifted slightly in her chair, signaling she wanted to address a more specific concern. She stated that some critics believe celebrities often frame controversies as personal struggles without fully acknowledging the broader impact of their actions. She asked Hammer directly whether he had reflected on how the allegations and headlines affected not just his career but public conversations about power dynamics. The studio audience grew noticeably still again. Hammer paused before answering. He said that the past few years forced him to confront aspects of himself he had not previously examined. He stated that public controversies can become symbolic, representing larger cultural conversations. He admitted that his situation was interpreted within those broader themes. He added that he has spent significant time listening rather than talking, trying to understand perspectives outside his own. Hostin responded by saying that listening is important, but accountability requires more than internal reflection. She asked whether he had engaged in any outreach or advocacy connected to the themes that surfaced in the public discourse. Her tone remained calm, but there was persistence behind the question. Hammer clarified that he has worked privately with counselors and participated in programs focused on behavioral health. He said he was not comfortable framing those efforts as public advocacy because they were personal commitments rather than campaigns. He emphasized that growth should not be performative. That statement drew a subtle reaction from the audience, some nods, a few murmurs of agreement. The moderator stepped in briefly to keep the exchange balanced, asking Hostin whether she felt that private change could ever be enough in cases that unfold publicly. Hostin answered thoughtfully. She said that private change is essential, but when someone's public platform contributed to their influence, rebuilding trust may require visible responsibility as well. Hammer acknowledged that point. He said he did not disagree that public figures carry added responsibility. However, he pushed back slightly on the idea that redemption must be publicly displayed. He said he believes consistency over time is more meaningful than a single grand gesture. For the first time, the two spoke in direct contrast. Hostin suggested that visible action demonstrates sincerity. Hammer countered that public gestures can sometimes be interpreted as strategic. There was no raised volume, but the exchange became sharper in its rhythm. Each waited for the other to finish, but their responses came more quickly now. One of the co-hosts tried to diffuse the tension by asking about the role of media coverage itself. She noted that headlines often exaggerate or oversimplify complex situations. Hammer agreed, stating that once a narrative takes hold, it can be difficult to correct. Hostin, however, cautioned against attributing everything to media framing. She said that while sensationalism exists, personal decisions still initiate public response. That comment brought a subtle shift in Hammer's demeanor. His jaw tightened briefly, though his voice remained level. He said he was not blaming the media entirely. He clarified that he accepts responsibility for his own choices. He simply wanted to point out that public discourse can amplify and distort beyond original circumstances. The studio audience reacted with a light ripple of applause when he acknowledged responsibility directly. It was not overwhelming, but it signaled engagement. Hostin nodded at that acknowledgement, and for a moment, the atmosphere softened. The moderator sensed the need to recalibrate and asked a broader question about forgiveness. She invited both Hammer and Hostin to speak to whether society allows room for growth after mistakes. Hostin answered first. She said forgiveness is possible but not automatic. It requires transparency, remorse, and sustained change. Hammer agreed with that framework. He said he does not expect immediate forgiveness and understands that trust rebuilds gradually. As the discussion continued, the pacing steadied. Hammer described how stepping away from high-profile environments changed his perspective. He said living outside the spotlight allowed him to reconnect with ordinary routines. Hostin listened, occasionally nodding, but remained focused. She asked one final pointed question in this segment: whether he believes his return to public interviews is premature. The question was delivered without hostility, but it was direct. Hammer took a longer pause this time. He admitted that there is no perfect timeline. He said he waited until he felt personally stable and professionally ready. He acknowledged that some people may feel differently and said he respects that. The moderator then signaled that they were nearing a commercial break. Before cutting away, she thanked Hammer for engaging seriously and thanked Hostin for articulating viewers' concerns. The audience applauded, though the applause felt more reflective than celebratory. As the cameras prepared to transition, viewers could sense that this exchange had not resolved every tension. Instead, it had laid out two perspectives clearly, one focused on personal growth and privacy, the other on visible accountability and public responsibility. Neither side had escalated beyond the boundaries of daytime decorum, but the seriousness of the dialogue remained evident. When the show returned from break, it was clear that the conversation would continue, and the remaining time would determine whether the exchange moved toward mutual understanding or revealed even deeper differences in perspective. When the program returned from commercial break, the tone at the table was composed but noticeably more deliberate. The moderator briefly recapped for viewers what had been discussed before the break, emphasizing that the conversation centered on accountability, public trust, and personal growth. The audience offered polite applause as the segment resumed, but the atmosphere remained serious rather than celebratory. Sunny Hostin adjusted her notes and leaned slightly forward again, signaling that she was not finished exploring the topic. This time, her approach was more analytical. She framed her next question around public perception versus legal standards. She clarified that in many cases involving high-profile figures, public opinion forms independently of any legal outcome. She asked Hammer how he differentiates between what is legally resolved and what is morally questioned in the court of public opinion. Hammer listened carefully. His hands were folded on the table, and he maintained steady eye contact. He acknowledged that legal processes and public narratives operate very differently. He explained that while legal systems rely on evidence and procedures, public conversations often rely on emotion, headlines, and personal interpretation. He said that navigating that difference had been one of the most difficult aspects of the past few years. Hostin nodded but pressed further. She asked whether he believed public figures sometimes hide behind legal technicalities to avoid addressing ethical concerns. The question was pointed, but her tone remained even. There was no accusation in her voice, but there was unmistakable firmness. Hammer responded in a measured way. He said that legal resolution does not erase moral reflection. He added that he has spent significant time evaluating his own behavior beyond legal definitions. He emphasized that growth is not about technicalities but about understanding impact. His voice was steady, though slightly quieter than before, which made the studio audience lean in. One of the other co-hosts shifted the focus briefly by asking how this experience has changed the way he views fame itself. Hammer answered that fame can distort reality. He said it can create distance between actions and consequences, and that stepping away from the spotlight forced him to confront that imbalance. The comments seemed to resonate with some audience members, who responded with a light murmur of agreement. Hostin followed up by asking whether he believes the industry enables that distortion. She clarified that Hollywood often insulates actors from ordinary accountability. Hammer acknowledged that the industry can create protective bubbles, but he cautioned against generalizing every experience. He said that while some environments encourage detachment, others demand professionalism and responsibility. At this point, the moderator gently reminded both of them to keep answers concise due to time constraints. The pacing quickened slightly, but the seriousness did not fade. Hostin then addressed the emotional side of public controversy. She said that for many viewers, headlines are not abstract. They can trigger personal memories or broader cultural concerns. She asked whether Hammer has considered how his situation may have intersected with larger social movements about power and consent. Hammer took a longer pause before answering. He acknowledged that his name became part of conversations much larger than his own story. He said he understands that people interpret events through the lens of broader cultural shifts. He expressed respect for those conversations and said that he does not dismiss the emotions attached to them. There was a brief moment of overlap when Hostin began to respond while he was finishing his sentence. Both stopped, and the moderator encouraged Hammer to complete his thought. He clarified that while he cannot control how narratives evolve, he accepts that public life carries amplified consequences. The exchange remained controlled, but the undercurrent of disagreement was still present. Hostin reiterated that public figures benefit from platforms that amplify their voices and therefore must accept amplified scrutiny as well. Hammer agreed in principle but reiterated that scrutiny should still allow room for complexity rather than reducing individuals to headlines. The audience reaction during this part of the segment was subdued but attentive. No one appeared restless. The room felt focused, as though viewers recognized that this was not a routine celebrity appearance. It was a serious conversation unfolding in real time. Another co-host asked about the practical realities of returning to work. She wanted to know whether colleagues had been supportive or cautious. Hammer answered that reactions have been mixed. Some peers reached out privately with encouragement. Others kept their distance. He said he understood both responses and did not harbor resentment. Hostin then asked whether he believes the public owes him neutrality while he rebuilds his reputation. The phrasing was deliberate. Hammer responded that he does not believe anyone owes him anything. He said trust is earned, not demanded. That answer drew a small but noticeable round of applause from parts of the audience. The moderator used that moment to steer the conversation toward reconciliation rather than confrontation. She asked both participants whether they believe American audiences are open to redemption stories. Hostin answered that audiences can be compassionate but also discerning. She said redemption requires more than time. It requires clarity and accountability. Hammer agreed, adding that redemption is not a single event but a sustained effort. As the segment progressed, the tone softened slightly. Hammer spoke about humility, describing how stepping out of the public eye altered his perspective. He said that losing professional momentum forced him to reevaluate priorities. He emphasized that personal stability mattered more than career rehabilitation at that stage. Hostin listened closely, her posture less rigid than earlier. She acknowledged that personal growth is complex. However, she reiterated that transparency builds trust. She said that audiences connect with honesty, even when it is uncomfortable. Hammer responded by saying he has tried to be honest without being sensational. He expressed concern that over-explaining can sometimes reignite speculation rather than resolve it. He stressed that his goal is steady, consistent behavior moving forward rather than dramatic statements. The conversation then touched briefly on the role of social media. One co-host observed that online platforms can intensify public judgment. Hammer agreed, noting that digital commentary can be relentless. Hostin countered gently that social media also gives voice to people who previously lacked access to public discourse. Hammer acknowledged that point, saying both realities can exist at the same time. As the segment moved toward its final stretch before another transition, there was a noticeable shift in body language at the table. The earlier tension had not disappeared, but it had transformed into a more structured exchange of perspectives rather than direct challenge and response. The moderator summarized the discussion so far, highlighting the central themes: accountability, privacy, redemption, and public trust. She thanked both Hammer and Hostin for engaging directly without avoiding difficult questions. While the conversation had moments of visible firmness, it never escalated beyond the norms of daytime television. There were no raised voices, no sharp retorts, just a steady exchange of differing viewpoints. The seriousness of the subject matter kept the audience attentive. As Part 3 concluded, viewers watching live could sense that the most intense portion of the disagreement had already unfolded, but unresolved questions still lingered. The final portion of the segment would determine how the conversation wrapped up, and whether the tone would settle into mutual understanding or remain cautiously divided. As the conversation moved into its final stretch before the closing segment, the tone felt steadier, though the seriousness remained. The moderator glanced at the clock and mentioned that they had limited time left but wanted to ensure a balanced conclusion. The audience shifted slightly in their seats, sensing that the discussion was approaching its final phase. Sunny Hostin took a breath before speaking again, and this time her delivery was less pointed and more reflective. She acknowledged that sitting at the table and answering direct questions on live television is not easy. She then clarified that her intention was never to personalize the exchange, but to reflect the concerns of viewers who struggle with how public figures navigate controversy and return to prominence. Armie Hammer nodded as she spoke. His posture, which earlier had appeared guarded, now seemed more open. He rested his hands flat on the table rather than clasped together. When he responded, his voice was calm and deliberate. He thanked her for the directness, saying that difficult questions are part of being in the public eye. He added that avoiding those questions would only deepen skepticism. Hostin then shifted slightly, framing her next point around responsibility to audiences who feel personally impacted by broader cultural issues. She explained that talk shows like this one often serve as a space where viewers process social conversations in real time. She asked Hammer whether he understands why some people feel emotionally invested in these discussions, even when they do not know him personally. Hammer responded without hesitation. He said he does understand that emotional investment. He explained that when headlines involve themes of power, trust, or personal conduct, audiences often filter those stories through their own experiences. He acknowledged that it can be difficult to separate an individual case from a larger societal context. The exchange at this point felt less like a disagreement and more like an effort to clarify perspectives. The tension that had surfaced earlier was still present, but it had evolved into something more constructive. There were no interruptions now. Each waited for the other to finish before responding. One of the co-hosts then asked a question that subtly reframed the conversation. She wondered aloud whether redemption in public life requires vulnerability beyond statements of growth. She asked Hammer what vulnerability looks like for him at this stage. Hammer paused again, though the pause felt less defensive and more contemplative. He said vulnerability, for him, has meant admitting mistakes privately before discussing anything publicly. He explained that therapy and honest conversations with family required him to confront uncomfortable truths. He added that vulnerability does not always have to be broadcast to be genuine. Hostin listened carefully and then offered a nuanced response. She said that private vulnerability can be meaningful, but public trust often depends on visible acknowledgement. She stressed that audiences want reassurance that lessons have been learned, not just implied. Her tone was measured and less challenging than earlier, but her point was clear. Hammer replied that he accepts that visible acknowledgement matters. He reiterated that he is not seeking immediate acceptance, only the opportunity to demonstrate consistency over time. He emphasized that actions, not interviews, will ultimately shape how he is perceived moving forward. The studio audience reacted with light applause at that statement. It was not enthusiastic or dramatic, but it indicated engagement. The moderator took that moment to thank the audience for their attentiveness, reminding viewers that live discussions can be complex and layered. As the final questions approached, Hostin offered what felt like a closing observation rather than a challenge. She said that part of her role at the table is to ask questions that viewers might hesitate to voice themselves. She acknowledged that the conversation had been serious, but said she believed seriousness is appropriate when discussing accountability. Hammer responded respectfully. He said he would rather have an honest exchange than a comfortable but superficial one. He added that avoiding difficult dialogue would not serve anyone, neither him nor the viewers. There was a brief moment when both shared a small, restrained smile, not as a sign of agreement on every point, but as acknowledgement that the exchange had remained civil despite tension. The body language across the table reflected a subtle easing. Shoulders relaxed slightly, and the pacing slowed. Another co-host shifted the tone gently by asking what Hammer hopes people will focus on moving forward. He answered that he hopes people observe consistency rather than expecting a single defining statement. He said he understands skepticism and is prepared to earn trust gradually. Hostin nodded at that, adding that time is often the true measure of change. She reiterated that public accountability is not about punishment but about ensuring that growth is authentic and sustained. The moderator then signaled that they were nearing the end of the segment. She summarized the key themes discussed: the tension between privacy and transparency, the difference between legal outcomes and public opinion, and the evolving nature of redemption in a highly connected world. Before transitioning, she gave Hammer an opportunity for a final comment. He thanked the panel for the conversation and said that while it may not resolve every concern, he appreciates the space to speak directly. His tone remained composed, without defensiveness. As the cameras prepared to move toward closing remarks, the audience offered a more unified round of applause. It felt respectful rather than celebratory, an acknowledgement of the seriousness of the exchange rather than endorsement of any single perspective. Viewers watching live could sense that while the disagreement between Armie Hammer and Sunny Hostin had been tense at moments, it never crossed into hostility. Instead, it reflected the type of measured, sometimes uncomfortable dialogue that daytime talk shows occasionally facilitate when public issues intersect with personal narratives. With only the final wrap-up remaining, the conversation had shifted from pointed questioning to cautious understanding. The remaining moments would determine how the episode would be remembered, not for dramatic confrontation, but for the way it handled a difficult topic in real time on live television. As the segment entered its final minutes, the moderator thanked Armie Hammer for joining the panel and acknowledged that the discussion had covered complex territory. The camera briefly widened to capture the full table, showing each host composed and attentive. The audience, which had remained largely quiet during the more serious exchanges, offered steady applause as the conversation formally transitioned toward closing remarks. Hammer gave a final brief statement, reiterating that he understands the weight of public scrutiny and that he does not take lightly the opportunity to speak directly to viewers. He said he recognizes that rebuilding trust is a gradual process and that he is prepared for it to take time. His tone remained consistent with how he had responded throughout the segment, measured, calm, and deliberate. Sunny Hostin then added a concluding thought of her own. She said that conversations like this are not meant to provide simple answers but to allow space for honest dialogue. She emphasized that accountability and growth can coexist, and that public figures returning to the spotlight should expect questions that reflect the concerns of audiences. Her delivery was steady and professional, without sharpness. The moderator thanked both of them again and noted that live television requires navigating complex discussions in real time. She reminded viewers that differing perspectives can exist at the same table without escalating into hostility. That statement seemed to frame the entire segment as an example of constructive disagreement rather than confrontation. As the camera cut to a wider audience shot, applause filled the studio once more. It was not exuberant or prolonged, but it was sustained. The applause felt like acknowledgement of a serious conversation handled within the boundaries of daytime decorum. No one appeared visibly upset or unsettled. The hosts exchanged polite nods, and Hammer offered a brief handshake across the table before stepping away. When the show moved into its next segment, the energy in the studio noticeably lightened. The contrast made it clear just how focused and intense the previous discussion had been. Viewers watching live likely felt the same shift, a release of tension once the accountability-centered dialogue had concluded. In the hours following the broadcast, clips from the exchange began circulating online. Social media reactions reflected a range of perspectives. Some viewers praised Sunny Hostin for asking direct, thoughtful questions that represented audience concerns. Others commended Hammer for remaining composed and engaging seriously rather than deflecting. There were also viewers who felt the conversation did not go far enough in one direction or the other, illustrating how divided public opinion can remain in situations involving controversy. Commentary across platforms focused less on any dramatic moment, because there had not been one, and more on the tone of the exchange. Many posts highlighted that the disagreement never escalated into shouting or interruption. Instead, it unfolded through steady, pointed questions and equally measured responses. That detail seemed to resonate with viewers who are accustomed to more heated televised debates. Media analysts discussing the segment later noted that it reflected a broader shift in daytime talk programming. Conversations involving public accountability are increasingly common, and audiences expect hosts to balance civility with firmness. The exchange between Hammer and Hostin was often described as an example of that balance, serious but controlled, tense at moments but not hostile. In interviews conducted after the show, panel representatives clarified that the questions had been prepared in advance, as is typical for live television segments involving sensitive topics. They emphasized that while the conversation was candid, it was not intended to ambush or provoke. Hammer's team also issued a short statement expressing appreciation for the opportunity to speak directly and reiterating his commitment to personal growth. The episode sparked further discussion about how talk shows navigate redemption narratives. Viewers debated whether public figures should face more intensive questioning before returning to mainstream platforms. Others argued that engaging in open dialogue on live television is itself part of accountability. The conversation extended beyond the show, reflecting ongoing cultural debates about responsibility and second chances. Inside the studio, staff later described the atmosphere as professional throughout. There were no visible conflicts once cameras stopped rolling. The hosts reportedly exchanged brief words off camera, maintaining the same respectful tone viewers saw on screen. That continuity reinforced the impression that the disagreement had been substantive but not personal. For many viewers, what stood out most was not a single line or expression, but the pacing of the conversation. It built slowly, intensified through pointed follow-up questions, and then gradually eased into reflection. There were moments of visible tension, slight pauses, measured tones, overlapping attempts to clarify, but none of it crossed the line into spectacle. Instead, it remained firmly within the norms of U.S. daytime talk show discourse. The segment ultimately demonstrated how live television can host difficult conversations without resorting to dramatization. Hammer's serious responses, paired with Hostin's deliberate questioning, created a dialogue that felt authentic to the format. It did not resolve every concern, nor did it aim to. Rather, it provided viewers with a window into how public accountability is negotiated in real time. As the episode continued into lighter topics, the earlier exchange lingered in viewers' minds. The absence of raised voices made the seriousness more noticeable. It was the controlled intensity, the measured pauses and thoughtful phrasing, that defined the moment. And that brings us to the end of this narration. If you watched the segment, you likely formed your own opinion about how the conversation unfolded and whether it struck the right balance between accountability and fairness. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.